Hi everyone, this is about fragrance for your brand and what you need to know. This is what we'll be covering. Some of the points relate to your fragrance brief. So this is really a preparatory presentation for you to be able to write a really good fragrance brief and work with a fragrance supplier. So I'm from a company called Olfiction, which is a portmanteau between olfaction and fiction. And I think of fragrance as writing a story just in another medium. And fragrance is a form of communication. And this is really important point actually for beauty brands that are thinking about fragrance, because you're communicating something about your products through the fragrance or the lack of fragrance in your products. We started about 7.5 years ago. I have a business partner called Nick Gilbert. He's a renowned fragrance expert in his own right, and we use our combination of skills to help fragrance businesses of all kinds. So what is fragrance? In a single sentence, fragrance is a mixture of raw materials blended according to a formula created by a perfumer. Fragrance is sometimes thought of or talked about as though it was a single line or single component, or that it's some kind of monstrous entity made up of 2,000, 3,000 materials. And neither of these extreme misconceptions is quite right. Fragrances can be anything from a couple of materials to 200, anything in between. Typical fragrances might have a few lines. Some perfumes that you wear on the skin, like an eau de toilette, they might be 75 lines or 36 or 150. You could make a simple aromatherapy fragrance that's only 4 lines. But those essential oils, natural raw materials themselves are mini fragrances in their own right, because they contain chemical constituents. And actually, if you exploded those out and looked at the chemicals in a natural fragrance, the list would probably be longer than 150 lines. In fact, all you'd have to do is add rose oil, which contains 350 chemicals in its own right. So here's a sort of a list for you to maybe save for later more than look at now, but these are the types of raw materials fragrances can be made from. And they're split between naturals that are harvested directly from botanical sources, nature identical synthetic molecules, but nevertheless they exist in nature. It's just that the molecules are being synthetically reproduced from other feedstock. And then synthetic materials. And synthetic materials themselves don't just all come from necessarily petrochemical sources. Some of them will come from fermentation or bioengineering or even upcycling waste products from other industries. Turpentine, wood pulp, for example, are good sources of chemical feedstocks to produce synthetic fragrance materials. And as a whole, the industry, of course, really stemmed into producing synthetic raw materials when you had the Industrial Revolution. But nowadays, we're all trying to move towards greener and more sustainable models. So fragrance industry too is trying to look at how to move away from crude oil and petrochemicals. And so even now there are actually a lot of synthetic materials that are available from non-petrochemical sources. And natural raw materials can be a complete material, so you could harvest something like lavender plants and you get the flowers, leaves and twigs made into essential oil. Or you have the orange tree, which produces orange oil from the peel of the orange. And then you have petitgrain from the leaves and twigs. And the flowers themselves produce botanical oil, orange blossom and neroli, depending on how it's processed. And so it isn't quite so clear cut as, okay, here are natural materials and here are synthetic materials. They arrive to us from different kinds of routes. One of the things I mentioned just now was sort of misconception, and oh boy, are there a lot about fragrance. And some of those are actually sort of historically created by the trade itself, because in the past, before social media, before blogs, before even advent of sort of glossy magazines, since time immemorial, fragrance has always seemed like a mysterious, magical process akin to alchemy. It's been something that's deliberately perhaps been presented as something magical and something that a normal person couldn't possibly understand. And of course, the idea of perfumers wandering around lavender fields, looking very pensive and smelling the air and creating some kind of masterpiece in their head while they're doing it, well, that seems much more magical than thinking about a perfumer sitting in front of a computer and trying to calculate the tiniest minutiae of regulatory compliance. And I guess in our work, we do a bit of both. I mean, you do have to, as a perfumer, go out there and be the dreamer too, but the language used about perfumery, how are you supposed to, as a person who isn't in the trade, really understand, for example, that notes lists aren't actually ingredients lists? So when you're looking at the notes lists presented to you by brands who sell perfume, they are sort of verbal mood boards. They're there to prime the consumer. They may include some ingredients that are actually in the product, but they're in fact a form of marketing. There's also this idea that you can have a non-toxic or clean fragrance, and then not only that, that if you were to do that, it has to be all natural. Well, both of these concepts are really wrong. First of all, it would be very strange for perfumers to deliberately be adding something into the products that would harm the consumer. No one wants that. And also, second point being that natural materials are actually usually the ones that cause us more problems, because the complexity I mentioned earlier, if you think you have a raw material that's actually a mini chemical formula in its own right, nature has produced something that has, let's say, four dozen lines on a chemical formula, and then maybe there's two of those lines that perhaps we don't want in the consumer product either at all or at a level where it could cause a problem. Well, now those hazardous constituents or allergens, we need to control those. So we need to either compose our fragrance in such a way that those constituents are limited, or we need to perhaps distill or process that material further to remove those problem chemicals. And so the idea that safety is determined by the origin of the material is not right. Safety is determined by context and dose and appropriate formulation and understanding what the trade tells us to do in terms of safety recommendations, limits, and working with experts and understanding the bigger picture. It's not just a sort of an isolated, oh, if I have a blend of essential oils, it's going to be perfect. And also in terms of sustainability or even your carbon footprint, if you think about how much human endeavor goes into harvesting something like rose petals, 4 tons of rose petals to get 1 kilo of rose oil, then the distillation itself, how much carbon is actually being used there, what about all the further processing, what about the transportation costs, whatever. So I'm not sort of saying that we should choose one over the other categorically, because of course naturals have wonderful aesthetic properties. They're beautiful. Our human brains respond to them, our emotions respond to them, so of course we want to keep using natural raw materials, but I think it's actually doing natural raw materials a disservice to paint them as faultless and angelic and automatically safe, because that actually leads to problems when it comes to future of our trade, future regulations and future formulation. So some of the questions you could be asking instead may be more strategic. Can you direct how your fragrance is actually created? Do you have any kind of line of communication either directly with the perfumer or to an evaluator at your fragrance house? How do your customers feel about fragrance? Are you aiming at a customer group who may be already conditioned to be really anti-fragrance, in which case, how are you going to negotiate this? Because there might be some product types where fragrance is really important. And are you going to then fall into the natural fallacy, but then maybe encounter problems later when people find that your product is not suitable for sensitive skin? So for example, if you wanted to make a completely allergen-free fragrance, you could only do that using synthetic raw materials. So it's a complex topic, and it absolutely isn't binary, natural or synthetic. So think about this a little bit beyond the surface, and certainly not as a either or. Creating fragrances is quite exciting to me because it's really like multifaceted puzzle solving. It's not just about the smell. You have to think about all these different facets, and each of the facets affects the other ones. So if you might be solving one side of it, oh, it smells wonderful, it smells exactly like the client wanted, then what if it's now not to their budget, or what if it's now not suitable for the product category that they want to use it in? So because there's so many facets to creating a fragrance and everything affects everything else, you do have to be quite good at informing your fragrance supplier or your perfumer in advance of some of the things that you want to achieve with your products, even if it doesn't seem to have anything to do with fragrance whatsoever. So you might be thinking, well, I'll eventually expand to USA. I'm just going to be selling in Europe for now, or the other way around, or I'd quite like to use this fragrance now in my cleansing balm, but I'm planning to use it also in a face moisturizer. Now, that might not seem like an important distinction for you, but one is a rinse-off product, one is a leave-on product, and one market has one set of regulations and one market has another set of regulations. So some of the things that we have to think about really are to do with all these different facets rather than just the smell. And so one of the most important takeaways from this entire presentation would be that you really need to tell your fragrance supplier in advance what types of products you'd like to use the fragrance for. This is one of the most common stumbling blocks where you sort of get far down the line and maybe the conversation wasn't clear, and then, oh yes, we want to use it here too, and that really should be prevented at the point of writing the fragrance brief. So since there's so many misconceptions about fragrance, and since it can be a difficult topic, and since creating your fragrance in tandem with the fragrance supplier or perfumer is actually quite a complex process, why bother with it? Why put fragrance? I mean, it'll add cost to your formula. Sometimes it's the costliest part of your formula. And yeah, arguably, I would say some products don't need it or shouldn't have it. So eye cream, does it need a fragrance? Maybe not. A barrier cream for damaged skin, probably not. There's lots of products where you could argue that fragrance is not necessary or could even be a hindrance. On the other hand, fragrance is a little bit like a soundtrack for film, in that it becomes inseparable from your product and it enhances its attributes to such a degree that studies have been done that you can have the exact same product formula, something like a shampoo, one without fragrance and one with a fragrance that really enhances the user experience. And people think that the shampoo is better. They're not saying, oh, I like this because it smells nice. They think their hair was shinier, in better condition, more manageable. And so that's a really crucial thing to understand, that actually fragrance and the product development needs to happen as a holistic process. The fragrance developer or your supplier of an off-the-shelf fragrance really needs to understand what it is that you're trying to communicate about your product, to whom you're communicating, and about what. And really, even if you're just looking at a basic malodor combating fragrance, even if it's, oh, I've got these vegetable oils, or I've got these waxes, or these other ingredients in the formula that make it smell a bit like crayons, or oh, it smells a bit fatty, and you're just looking to cover that odor, even then it will actually really help your sales. It would actually really help the user experience. It will help people become obsessed about your product and really develop a relationship with your product where they want to repurchase it if the fragrance is right for that product type. So clearly fragrance regulations and cosmetic regulations, they could be an entire seminar in their own right, and you need to be a regulatory professional to really go into it in depth. But you do need to be aware that there are regulations that differ from region to region. And the reason you need to be aware of at least that is that when you're sourcing your fragrance, when you're asking for someone to create a fragrance or supply an existing fragrance to you, one of the things that needs to go on your fragrance brief is where you're going to be selling the product, because regional examples can be as small as California, a single state determining that certain things need to be mentioned. Or they can be as broad as the EU, which of course includes several countries. And ultimately, the entire fragrance journey from where the materials have been grown and harvested and processed, or where they've been created in a lab, ultimately the ingredients themselves have come under various regulations through their journey. And then the finished fragrance oil, when it's treated as an industrial product, that comes under different regulations than the fragrance when it's in your cosmetic product or your household product. And so here's a sort of a really broad overview of some of the different layers of regulatory bodies that affect how your fragrance is regulated and then how your end product is regulated. So rather than sort of list various regulatory bodies and I can just imagine all the eyes glazing over, I wanted to show you sort of from my point of view, what would I see if I was doing a fragrance for an aromatherapy brand, or somebody who said, oh, I want my products to smell like a spa, and I want it to be all natural. And well, okay, well, here's an example then. Let's have a few lines of natural products. And remember, all of these materials like lavender oil, rosemary oil, they would have a mini formula within themselves. They're actually in themselves little mini fragrances created by nature. So actually the ingredients, the chemicals in this formula would run into the several dozen, but the formula looks deceptively simple with all these complex materials. And so the reason you're seeing all those CLP hazard pictograms is because of all the chemicals found naturally in these complex raw materials. And so there's all kinds of things there, from irritation, which is the exclamation mark. That's quite common. That's really difficult to avoid because you'd get that if something is irritating to the eye, and I can't think of many things that aren't. But then there's things like flammable or aspiration risk, or even hazardous to the aquatic environment. So those are all relating to those individual raw materials and the hazardous components, chemical components they contain at their undiluted form. And then what I would look at is, okay, well, what are the inclusion levels in the product types? Is this going into a household product, or is it going into a spa product? Is it going into a perfume? And depending on the categories and type of product this would be included in, I would be able to look at the classes of the International Fragrance Association recommendations. 12 is a candle, so that's 100%, because you're not expecting people to take a candle and rub it on their skin, hopefully. 4 is fine fragrance perfume, so I could actually make a perfume out of this if I added some ethanol and water. I could add this at up to 15% into a perfume. It wouldn't really develop very well on skin, mind you, but you could do it. And then you've got all these other categories for shampoo, rinse off products, leave-on products, even lip products. And the cosmetic regulation categories for Europe, in this case, on my software, they show sort of a parallel set of inclusion level maximums that I would have to observe. which run parallel to IFRA. They're not identical. And in this case, I'm absolutely fine for rinse-off product, should I want it in a shampoo. Leave-on product, I could even put quite a lot in on a leave-on product, and then it would be up to me and the brand to decide what's an appropriate level for that actual product and the user experience. And then we see a list of allergens there that would have to be listed on the packaging, and those are completely dependent on the inclusion level. So if we included it at 0.2% or 2%, the listed allergens would change quite dramatically because it's based on how much of the allergen ends up in the finished product. So just as a counterpart, I wanted to show you an example regulatory landscape if I were to do a almost completely synthetic fragrance. So this is a shampoo fragrance. There's a couple of allergens you'd have to list if we were to include this in the product at 2%. And the hazard pictograms don't look anywhere near as scary. Those relate to the CLP regulation, classification, labeling and packaging regulation, which comes ultimately from the United Nations. It's called the globally harmonized system, the overarching system, but it's actually not really harmonized, so that's sort of slightly ironic. But every region that has some kind of labeling and transport regulations about hazardous chemicals will have a similar system, if not a sort of a mirror of this. So you'll see when you sometimes see trucks going around with flammable pictogram in the back, or you might get a canister into your factory that has all kinds of hazard diamonds on it. Those are all relating to the industrial handling of chemicals, and that's of course what chemicals are, what fragrance is made of, so natural or synthetic. And the irony is that the synthetic ones are less hazardous, and this is often really misunderstood. And similarly, if I wanted to make this shampoo completely allergen free at the point of inclusion, I could actually, and so that's another interesting fact here, is that for rinse-off product not to have any allergens present at a level where they would be significant enough to be listed. And by the way, the listing limit is pretty tight, so that would mean that it's highly unlikely anyone would react. I could easily make this fragrance completely allergen free, whereas I couldn't do it with the other one really. Some of the things you should ask for or be automatically provided and offered include obviously a safety data sheet, which relates to the globally harmonized system we just saw. The safety data sheet should ideally be in the language of the country that you operate in or the product is ending up in. And this is really relevant information for the stages of transport, storage and handling as the full concentrate. And some people get scared looking at safety data sheets, but as you just saw, you know, a bunch of essential oils look really scary when you look at them from a hazard perspective. So as long as you follow the correct handling and storage instructions and don't flush them down the drain, you're fine. One of the most hazardous things to pour down the drain is lavender oil. I once worked in a factory where a very unconcerned factory floor compounder who didn't really care about safety, who, by the way, did get sacked in the end, once spilled a whole barrel of lavender oil. And instead of using the spill kit in the factory, as you would correctly do, he just thought, oh, what the hell, and just swept it down the drain. And a few days later, we had the local water board down saying, what's going on? Hang on, shouldn't you have done something else? And so, yeah, safety data sheets, good to look at how you're supposed to store and handle and dispose of materials. That's what they're for. And they're also for safe transportation. And if you look at them, they tell you information that can also be then useful for preparing consumer products for the household market, because some of those hazard statements and pictograms end up on, for example, a diffuser bottle or a candle packaging or household cleaner. And so those hazard pictograms that end up on a consumer product relate to the ones that you would look at in the concentrate, but they're, like allergens, calculated based on the inclusion level of the fragrance. So you might have a scary looking canister, but if you've only included 10% of that fragrance in your candle, you might actually drop below a point of hazard, and your candle packaging might not have a single pictogram, or it might just have the exclamation mark. So safety data sheets relate to all these things. And then the allergen certificate, that's to do with cosmetic regulation in the EU, specifically the cosmetic laws, and IFRA certificate, International Fragrance Association certificate, that gives you, or should give you, maximum inclusion levels per product category. And you would have hopefully discussed thoroughly with your fragrance supplier what inclusion level they recommend and what you'd like to use for your product to be optimized for a lovely experience. And it is useful to have a certificate of analysis per batch, because when your fragrance arrives, it's really nice for your traceability within your manufacturing environment to be able to take quality control samples of each container that arrives and marry those to the batch numbers in your certificate of analysis, and then make sure that you have some traceability between your product batches and the fragrance batches and containers that were used. So I know sometimes you won't be able to tell exactly what container the fragrance came from, but at least if you can trace the batch, should there be any problems, you have that full line going all the way back to the fragrance. And then storing fragrance, you should obviously keep it away from anywhere where it could get really hot or frozen or catch fire, but also really be careful about things like cross-contamination. So if you're pouring fragrance from a canister into a metal bucket and then pour another fragrance and then pour some of it back, well, now you've contaminated your fragrance. And obviously you should try not to have bits go into it or have it oxidized. So if the fragrance canister is really, really low and there's a lot of air sitting on top, if that fragrance then sits in your factory or warehouse for a year, the oxygen up top might have oxidized it. So you should have really transferred it into a smaller container. And obviously look at the safety data sheet for the correct storage instructions always. So you actually need to make a decision between different mutually incompatible factors when you're deciding what kind of fragrance and from whom you should be including in your products. Because if, let's say that you're a very exclusive brand, let's say you're in fact a beauty brand just going to be sold in 2 high-end spas, you're not going to be manufacturing thousands of units of product. You'll just have a few hundred units a year, and your fragrance inclusion levels are really low. And so in actual fact, you'll only be buying under 10 kilos of fragrance total, for instance. Well, at that point, you may be better off considering an off-the-shelf fragrance or something that has a starting point and is just modified for you, or if you're prepared to pay for the R&D phase, by all means work with a perfumer and have a bespoke fragrance made, but you've got to understand they're not going to make any money on your project whatsoever. So it's pure risk for them. So at that point, you would have to pay up in advance, effectively, the profit that they would get from the sale of a fragrance oil for a larger brand. Most fragrance suppliers and even some independent perfumers or sort of smaller fragrance houses work on a model of there being a sort of a sliding scale between how much fragrance oil are you going to be buying versus what does it cost to actually have that fragrance developed for you. So you need to think about all these different facets of your branding. How important is fragrance to your branding? Do you want to mimic existing signatures out there, in which case perhaps an off-the-shelf fragrance might work? Or do you want to have a really totally unique brand signature that's recognizably your brand, even if you have different fragrances across your brand? But you can probably name a couple of cosmetic brands where it's obvious that the fragrance is from that brand, even if the fragrances between their different product types are different. And so think about these attributes. What matters to you? Where do you want to invest? How much is that fragrance going to cost you initially in the investment stage? Because of course an R&D fee is a one-off. You don't then have to continuously add that to your product costings worksheet. Or are you thinking, no, I don't want to invest so much in the beginning, maybe I want to do a proof of concept, and then if the brand takes off, perhaps at that point we'll have a bespoke fragrance. There's all kinds of options, but you really should think about, for instance, whether fragrance is an important factor for a particular product type or for the consumers that you're hoping to attract. And whether it's something that you want to invest in straight away or later on, and you need to have a clear idea in your mind about what's in it for the fragrance supplier, quite frankly, because if you turn up and say, well, I'm actually going to only buy 2 kilos of fragrance and I probably won't come back for 2 years, and oh, by the way, I want you to develop something completely bespoke for these new products that you've never worked with, these completely new formulas that don't exist in your database, and yeah, I want it for free, then that's not going to happen. So you need to think about, how do we find a mutually beneficial way of working with a fragrance supplier or an independent perfumer. So how does a perfumer work exactly? Once they know the sort of more prosaic side of things, once they understand the poetic side of things, once they know what you're dreaming of, what your brand vision is, what stories you wanting to tell, what ingredients is it that you want to talk about, is there something that you want to really draw on, is there some concept that you're wanting to really pull on for the consumer's imagination. All these different things come into it. You end up going through this sort of process that involves these different hats you're wearing almost. So you start off as the dreamer, you start off as the perfumer, perhaps wandering down the lavender fields. I often wander down the forest paths. And you then have to become the artist, and you have to think of your raw materials as an artistic medium. But then you become the serious person, the formulator, and you start thinking about, okay, well, performance and stability, cost contribution, is it suitable for this particular formula? What kind of impact is it going to have? Is it a waste of money in this product type? Will it just disappear into the formula? All these different things come to it when you're formulating, and you're looking at your fragrance from all these different facets. At that point, you're looking at your formulating software, or you're measuring things out by hand and having a look at how they interact. All these different parts come into it. And then at that point, you also need to become a problem solver. Perhaps your client has asked you something that's difficult to deliver. Maybe they wanted something that was quite challenging. So you tackle the problem, and in itself becomes creatively quite inspiring. And at some point you then submit your samples to the client, and the client then feeds back and maybe wants some changes, or maybe doesn't understand a facet that you've tried to communicate through the fragrance, or maybe just thinks, oh no, this is nothing like I imagined. And at that point you need to find a way to communicate, and this can be the sort of make or break situation. Are you able to communicate your exact wants and needs, or what you don't like, what you do like? Why is it that you don't feel it's on brief? How is it that you'd like it to be changed. And at that point, it can be helpful if there's almost an interpreter between you, and that can be a fragrance evaluator. In some companies, they're called scent design managers. Whatever the role title, it's basically somebody who's acting as a in-between and a sort of an interpreter between client and perfumer. So that can sometimes really help. But however you do it, communication is absolutely crucial to fragrance development, even if you're buying an off-the-shelf fragrance, because you might not be able to quite specify what it is that you're looking for. And so you need somebody at the other end who can really kind of get that information out of you, but also you need to be able to provide as much information as possible and be as clear as possible and be as honest as possible. I think one of the worst things is when people think, oh no, I can't say what I really think. It's like, oh no, please do. That's actually really important. And sometimes it helps in the communication phase for you to also, way before the fragrance actually gets developed, is for you to talk about your olfactive preferences that have nothing to do with your brand, but just your own personal taste too, and communicate clearly with the fragrance house or the perfumer that's those are the sort of things that you personally like, because that can help avoid something or include something based on that conversation. So let's say that you, for instance, have a sort of visceral hate of lavender smell. You just can't stand it. And if you didn't say that in the beginning, and let's say you were creating a cleansing balm, and maybe it's for sensitive skin, or maybe it's a sleeping time cleansing balm, and now you've gone off down a road where the perfumer might draw some conclusions based on what they've done before, and they present you with a lavender heavy fragrance, and you go, oh no, I hate it. Please make it less like this. And there's got to be some way to excavate the true reasons for your feedback. But ultimately, all of these things can be stumbling blocks if thought wasn't put into the fragrance brief and the early stages and the whole process prior to briefing the perfumer. So the fragrance brief. These are some of the basic things you should have thought through prior to asking someone to supply you a fragrance, be it a bespoke fragrance that you'd like them to create for you or an off-the-shelf fragrance that you'd like to source. And you may be going to a large fragrance house if you're buying in high volumes, or you have a really high value project, and they may give you a form to fill out. They might have a whole process where you get to talk to a salesperson, an evaluator, maybe even directly to the perfumer. But in any case, there's possibly some extra steps that will help you. But before you approach anyone, you should have thought through a whole bunch of stuff. So the olfactory profile, ironically, is almost the last thing, because it comes from all these other things. What region are you going to be selling in? How will the product be retailed? Is it from websites? Is it from pharmacies? Is it from spas? Is it from beauty salons? Is it from dedicated boutiques? Is it direct to consumer in some other way? That actually affects things. Who is your target consumer? Who is it that's going to be hopefully falling in love with your product? And what do they already use? What are their likes and dislikes? How is your brand different? How is your brand unique? What is it that you're wanting to actually tell about your brand through your products, and inevitably therefore through the fragrance? And then the more pragmatic things of how many kilos of fragrance oil are you likely to buy, what your ultimate products will retail at, what's the price of the product, and that will then determine your fragrance budget. How much are you going to allocate for the fragrance on your product costings worksheet? All these different things are really important to have thought through prior to talking to a fragrance supplier. And hopefully you'll understand some of the reasons why they go from the sort of dull but necessary regulatory side to the actual artistic and poetic creativity. You have a better chance of communicating during the development process too. And so the feedback between you and the fragrance supplier or perfumer is going to be smoother if you've got a clearly defined idea of what it is that you're actually looking for. And there's no reason why you can't, in addition to providing the basic information, then chat through your olfactive profile preferences or your hopes just in person. But all the other stuff is really important because that determines what the scope of the project is, what it's going to cost you to have the fragrance, and how long it's going to take you to actually get the fragrance developed or sourced, who you're going to even go to in the first place, because some people will turn you away if the project isn't big enough. And all these different facets are really important to have worked out prior. So just wanted to thank you for coming, thank you for attending, and hopefully there'll be lots of very smart future clients out there for fragrance suppliers and perfumers of all kinds. And obviously, if you have any questions about the conference itself, then talk to Jen. But if you wanted to ask me anything about fragrance, then do email me or contact me through Instagram. And I hope you enjoyed the presentation. Thank you.